There's a type of person who can walk into any situation, any conversation, any conflict, any outcome, and emerge from it as the one who was wronged. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It could be that they were passed over for a promotion they didn't earn, or they drove someone away with behavior they refused to examine. And yet, in their account of events, they are always the one who suffered. What's strange isn't that this happens. What's strange is how consistent it is. The narrative never changes. The villain may rotate, but the role stays the same. And here's what most people miss entirely. This isn't weakness. It isn't stupidity. It is, in a precise psychological sense, a survival strategy, one that began working a long time ago and never got updated. The term victim mentality gets misused constantly. It gets thrown at people who are genuinely suffering. It gets weaponized in arguments. And because of that, most people either dismiss it entirely or use it too broadly to be useful. But there is a real psychological phenomenon here, one that researchers have studied under frameworks like external locus of control, learned helplessness, and self-serving attribution bias. And what these frameworks reveal is something far more nuanced than this person is just complaining. What they reveal is a cognitive architecture, a stable, self-reinforcing pattern of perception that filters incoming information to protect a fragile identity. Not consciously, not maliciously, automatically. The person isn't lying about their experience. They genuinely perceive events the way they describe them. The distortion happens upstream, at the level of attention, interpretation, and memory. That's what makes this pattern so difficult to challenge and so important to understand. To understand victim mentality, you have to understand how human beings assign cause. When something bad happens to most people, the mind immediately runs an attribution process. Why did this happen? Who is responsible? What does this say about me? In psychologically healthy attribution, this process is flexible. Sometimes you were at fault, sometimes external circumstances were. The mind can tolerate both answers. In victim mentality, the attribution process becomes rigid and asymmetric. The attribution theory, developed in the 1970s and extensively validated since, maps exactly how this works. Negative outcomes get attributed to external, stable, uncontrollable forces, like other people's malice, bad luck, or systemic unfairness. Positive outcomes, when they occur, get attributed to chance, or they get minimized entirely. This asymmetry does something specific to the nervous system. It eliminates the possibility of agency. If nothing good that happened to you was your doing, and everything bad that happened was someone else's, you have, in effect, removed yourself from the equation of your own life. And here's the deeper pattern most people overlook. This isn't random. This is regulation. This asymmetric attribution pattern protects against a specific kind of psychological pain. The pain of self-responsibility when the self doesn't feel strong enough to carry it. In the late 1960s, a series of experiments were conducted that would become foundational to our understanding of depression and passive behavior. Dogs exposed to inescapable shocks, even when the shock could later be escaped, simply stopped trying to escape. They had learned, at a neurological level, that their actions had no effect on their environment. That was called learned helplessness, and subsequent research, including work extended into what was called explanatory style, showed that humans develop the same pattern, not just in response to trauma, but in response to sustained environments where agency felt unavailable. Here's what matters for victim mentality specifically. Learned helplessness doesn't feel passive to the person experiencing it. It feels like an accurate perception of reality. The person genuinely believes that effort won't produce change, because in their formative environment, it often didn't. This is why confronting someone in this pattern with evidence of their agency frequently doesn't work. You're not engaging with a belief. You're engaging with a nervous system memory, a deeply encoded orientation toward the self and the world that predates the current argument. The belief that nothing I do matters isn't a conclusion someone reached. It's a wound that got organized into a worldview. Here's where it gets psychologically precise, and where most popular explanations fall short. Victim mentality isn't just a response to past pain. It becomes an identity structure, and identity structures are among the most defended psychological objects a human being has. To understand why, consider the function this pattern actually serves. When you are the victim in every narrative, several things become possible that wouldn't be otherwise. You are absolved of the responsibility to change. You are provided with a stable explanation for why life has unfolded the way it has. You are protected from the deeply threatening question, what if I contributed to this? Psychologists studying self-concept maintenance, including research on cognitive dissonance theory, have consistently found that people will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve a stable, coherent self-image, even when that self-image is painful. A victim identity is painful, but it is coherent, and coherence to the nervous system feels safer than the destabilizing alternative. This is what makes the pattern so sticky. The person isn't choosing suffering, they're choosing stability, the only kind available to them, with the psychological resources they currently have. The deeper pattern, victim mentality, functions as identity containment. It keeps the self intact by keeping the cause of pain outside the self. And the more that identity becomes the organizing narrative of someone's life, the relationships they've built around it, the explanations they've given, the worldview that depends on it, the higher the psychological cost of giving it up. This is not weakness. This is a sophisticated, if ultimately limiting, form of self-protection. There's a concept in clinical psychology called secondary gain, the indirect benefits that a symptom or pattern provides beyond its stated purpose. In victim mentality, the secondary gains are significant and worth naming precisely, because without understanding them, attempts to help someone in this pattern will consistently fail. Secondary gain number 1, social positioning. Victimhood, particularly in social contexts, functions as a claim to moral authority. The person who was wronged cannot be challenged without risk of appearing callous. This provides a kind of interpersonal safety, a position from which one cannot easily be attacked. Secondary gain number 2, relational leverage. Suffering communicated consistently becomes a form of influence. It obligates others, generates guilt, and shapes the behavior of people in the vicinity. This is usually unconscious. It's not calculated manipulation. It's learned behavior that got reinforced because it worked. Secondary gain number 3, identity coherence, which we've already touched on, but it bears repeating here. The narrative of victimhood provides a complete and stable account of why things are the way they are, and complete accounts, even painful ones, are psychologically preferable to ambiguity. Understanding secondary gains is not about condemning the person in this pattern. It's about understanding why telling them to just take responsibility, without addressing the functions the pattern serves, almost never works. You are not offering an upgrade, you're offering destabilization, and the nervous system will resist that every time. No pattern exists in isolation. Victim mentality is interpersonally maintained. Research in social psychology, including work on accommodation and codependency dynamics, shows that the people around someone in this pattern are not passive observers. They participate in it, often without realizing it. They over-explain their decisions to avoid triggering a victim narrative. They absorb guilt for outcomes they didn't cause. They begin walking on eggshells, calibrating their behavior to avoid becoming the next villain in someone else's story. This is called behavioral accommodation, and it does something counterproductive. It confirms the worldview. If everyone around you consistently softens, adjusts, and apologizes, that is experiential evidence that you are, in fact, fragile, and the world is, in fact, dangerous. The most emotionally intelligent response to someone in this pattern is not confrontation, and it is not accommodation. It is calm, consistent refusal to reorganize around their perception, holding clear behavioral limits without emotional escalation, without hostility, and without taking on responsibility that isn't yours. This is behaviorally demanding. It requires the person responding to tolerate being cast as the villain, without defending themselves, without collapsing, and without overcorrecting. It requires what regulation researchers call non-reactive stability, remaining present and grounded while someone else's dysregulation attempts to pull you in. That's a high EQ skill, and it's the only response that doesn't inadvertently extend the pattern. Change in this pattern is possible, but it doesn't follow the routes most people assume. It doesn't come from being told the truth bluntly. It doesn't come from losing relationships, jobs, or consequences, at least not directly. Consequences without context tend to be absorbed into the existing narrative, more evidence of an unfair world. What the research on therapeutic change, particularly work derived from cognitive behavioral therapy, schema therapy, and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, consistently shows is this: change requires a safe enough context in which the cost of self-responsibility becomes bearable. That means the psychological work isn't primarily about dismantling the victim narrative. It's about building the internal resources that make taking responsibility feel survivable rather than annihilating. This involves developing what psychologists call internal locus of control, the belief, built through accumulating evidence of one's own agency, that actions have effects. It involves tolerating self-scrutiny without collapsing into shame, and it involves constructing a self-concept stable enough that one bad truth about oneself doesn't destabilize the whole structure. This is slow work. It is identity-level work, and it almost always requires a witness, a person, a therapeutic relationship, a community that holds enough safety to make the examination feel less like annihilation and more like growth. The pattern isn't a character flaw. It is a developmental arrest at the point where agency became too threatening to inhabit, and developmental arrests can be resolved, not through force, but through the gradual experience of a different kind of possible. What stands out most about this pattern is this: the people who recognize it in themselves, even faintly, even uncomfortably, are already doing something rare. Because victim mentality, by design, redirects attention outward, it makes self-examination feel like self-betrayal. So, if some part of this landed in a way that created discomfort, that discomfort is information. It doesn't mean you are this pattern. It may mean you've noticed it operating somewhere in your experience, in someone close to you, in a version of yourself from a different chapter, or in some smaller corner of how you currently move through conflict. People with genuine emotional intelligence don't dismiss that discomfort. They get curious about it. If this kind of psychological pattern recognition is something you find valuable, the kind of content that helps you see beneath surface behavior to what's actually driving it, there's more of it here. Take your time with what you just heard. This kind of insight compounds slowly.